unexpectedly interrupted. Just after sunrise, a tourist set out early to enjoy a peaceful hike along a temple trail. As he walked through the lush greenery, something unusual caught his eye. A pale shape partially hidden among the trees. At first, he assumed it was a piece of clothing or a forgotten item left behind. But as he got closer, a sense of unease set in. Realizing the seriousness of what he had found, he quickly contacted local authorities. Emergency responders arrived promptly, and with the help of identification documents and hotel records, they were able to confirm the woman's identity. Her name was Miriam Bielta. Miriam Bielta was born on November 29, 1992, in the historic town of Hildesheim, located in Lower Saxony, Germany. Raised in a loving, supportive home, she grew up surrounded by encouragement, curiosity, and a deep respect for learning. Her parents instilled in her a strong moral compass, and her natural empathy made her a trusted friend to many. That balance of compassion and intellect became a defining part of who she was. By the time she reached adulthood, Miriam had already developed into a driven and accomplished young woman. She pursued engineering at one of Germany's top universities, where she quickly earned the admiration of her professors and peers. Known for her sharp, analytical thinking and calm, measured approach to challenges, she thrived in an academic environment that demanded both precision and creativity. But Miriam wasn't just focused on books and lectures. Outside the classroom, she explored a wide range of passions: photography, hiking, and volunteering for environmental causes. Nature was her refuge. Whether she was hiking through forests, capturing landscapes on camera, or working on community cleanup projects, she felt most at peace when surrounded by the beauty of the natural world. Those close to her often said that she lived with intention. She believed in making the most out of every experience, big or small. Travel, in particular, was one of her greatest joys, not just as a way to unwind, but as a way to connect with different cultures, broaden her perspective, and deepen her understanding of the world. So in early 2019, it came as no surprise to those who knew her when she began planning a trip to Thailand. It was a destination that seemed to capture everything she loved: lush landscapes, rich cultural heritage, and a spirit of adventure. For Miriam, this trip wasn't just about taking a break. It was an opportunity to merge her love for travel with personal reflection and exploration. She had often extended her work trips to soak in the local atmosphere, and Thailand was no different. This time, she looked forward to experiencing its beauty firsthand. Her itinerary was carefully crafted. After a series of meetings with suppliers in Bangkok, meetings her colleagues later confirmed had gone exceptionally well, Miriam decided to take a short detour. She planned to visit Pattaya, and then the lesser-known but serene island of Koh Sichang. It was the kind of location that offered solitude and scenic beauty, a stark contrast to the bustling urban centers she had just left behind. By mid-March, she had arrived on the island. Nestled among the cliffs and sea breezes, Sichang offered a slower pace of life, the kind Miriam found deeply soothing. Her hotel, a modest but charming guest house not far from the beach, became her base. The staff remembered her as polite and thoughtful, someone who seemed to be deeply engaged with the place rather than merely passing through. On one of her final days on the island, Miriam planned to visit an old temple perched high on a hill, an ancient site known for its spiritual energy and panoramic views. Accessible only by a winding stairway hidden behind lush vegetation, the temple was rarely crowded, appealing primarily to those who sought reflection and solitude. Miriam, always respectful of local traditions, had read about the temple in a travel forum and made it one of the highlights of her trip. That morning, everything appeared normal. Locals observed her leaving her guest house with a small backpack, a bottle of water, and her camera. She smiled at the vendor arranging flowers near the foot of the temple stairs and parked her rented motorbike nearby. Surveillance footage later confirmed she had ascended the steps alone, moving with quiet confidence and a calm, thoughtful demeanor. The flower vendor recalled her pausing briefly to admire a jasmine bouquet before heading upward. But as the day wore on, things took an unexpected turn. The motorbike remained parked in the same spot by sunset. The vendor, who had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the island's visitors, noticed this first. He hadn't seen Miriam return from the hill, and that absence began to weigh heavily on his mind. By morning, her belongings were still untouched. The realization that something was wrong began to ripple through the community. Hotel staff attempted to reach her by phone, but calls went unanswered. Messages were left. Her absence was eventually reported to local authorities. When investigators began retracing the last known steps of Miriam Bielta, it quickly became clear that her presence on Sichang Island was never intended to be an extended stay. In fact, her itinerary revealed something far more routine and structured. A brief excursion, just 1 day in duration. She had planned it down to the hour. Arrive in the morning, visit a scenic hilltop temple, capture a few photos, enjoy a peaceful lunch overlooking the sea, and then return to the mainland by evening. It was the kind of plan that reflected Miriam's personality in every detail. Precise, intentional, and cautious. Those who knew her well weren't surprised by the structure of her schedule. Miriam was known to be a highly organized individual. She wasn't one to take spontaneous risks, especially in unfamiliar places. She avoided interactions with strangers unless absolutely necessary, kept her belongings close and secure, and made a point of checking in regularly with family back home. It wasn't simply a habit. It was part of how she made travel feel safe and fulfilling. So when her messages stopped arriving on April 7th, it was more than just a lapse in communication. It was a warning sign. By midday, she was no longer responding to messages. By evening, the silence was complete. Her family, accustomed to receiving updates from her during trips, began to grow worried. What began as mild concern quickly escalated into alarm. It wasn't like Miriam to go off the grid, even for a few hours. That night, uncertainty took root. By the following morning, with no new messages and no check-ins, her loved ones contacted both the German embassy and the local authorities in Thailand, reporting her as missing. Back on the island, the police were already reviewing surveillance footage obtained from the temple trail and the area surrounding the hill. The video showed Miriam climbing the steps toward the temple just as the morning sun began filtering through the trees. She walked steadily, a bottle of water in one hand and a small backpack over her shoulder. Her expression was peaceful. She even smiled briefly at something off camera, perhaps a passing bird or a scenic view. That image, still and silent, would become the final confirmed moment of her presence on the island. It was only after authorities began speaking to local residents and shopkeepers that a new detail emerged, one that added a layer of mystery to the already troubling situation. A few days before she disappeared, Miriam had been seen sitting at a small cafe near the main pier. She was not alone. Witnesses remembered her speaking with a man, someone not known to them, and notably not a fellow traveler staying in the usual hotels. While no one could definitively identify him, those who saw the interaction described it as casual, but familiar, as though they'd met before. Whether he was someone she had encountered during her travels, or perhaps connected to her through her work, remained unclear. After that meeting, however, no one reported seeing them together again. The man never checked into any hotel nearby, nor did he appear on ferry logs as a regular visitor. Still, the memory of that coffee shop conversation lingered as a curious and potentially significant clue. Then came April 8th. Just after sunrise, the peaceful calm of the island was disrupted. A Thai tourist had risen early to hike the temple trail, hoping to enjoy the morning's cool air and the soft light through the trees. As he ascended the stone steps, winding through dense foliage, he noticed something odd in the undergrowth just off the path. Amid the rich green of the jungle, something pale and unmoving drew his attention. At first, he thought it might be a discarded piece of clothing or perhaps a forgotten item left by another hiker. But as he stepped closer, the shape became more unsettling. Clearly not part of the natural surroundings. Disturbed by the scene, the tourist immediately contacted local emergency services. Within an hour, police and rescue teams had begun ascending the hill, the mood shifting from routine concern to focused urgency. News spread quickly across the island, and by late morning, a growing number of residents had gathered near the trail's entrance, anxious to understand what was unfolding. Simultaneously, more than 9,000 kilometers away in Germany, Miriam's family was facing a rising tide of dread. When the call came confirming that a woman matching her description had been found near the temple, hope gave way to heartache. Authorities worked swiftly to confirm her identity. Based on travel documents, personal effects, and reports from the hotel, the woman was soon identified as Miriam Bielt, the 26-year-old tourist whose absence had triggered the search. At first, local authorities considered the possibility that her death had been the result of an accident. Perhaps a slip on the uneven, sometimes damp trail. The terrain was known to be tricky in places, especially during the early morning hours when dew could make the stone surfaces slick. But upon further inspection of the scene, and after analyzing the footage, that theory began to unravel. Investigators focused their attention on surveillance footage captured at the trailhead and surrounding facilities. In one clip, just minutes after Miriam had disappeared from view, another figure appeared. A man dressed in dark clothing, who seemed to be walking the same path at a cautious pace. He maintained a distance, but his presence was unmistakable. He was not someone police had previously identified in connection with Miriam. The same camera later captured his return. His clothes appeared damp and dirtied, with noticeable light smudges across his trousers and sleeves. He glanced around frequently, his movements anxious and hurried. Police soon returned to the flower vendor stationed at the base of the hill. He too remembered the man. At first, he hadn't thought much of it. Tourists came and went often, and solo travelers were not uncommon. But upon closer questioning, he described the man's behavior in more detail. When asked if he had seen anything unusual, the vendor recalled how the man had returned down the trail appearing unsettled. When casually asked if everything was all right, the man replied with a shrug, claiming he had slipped and gotten a bit muddy. Surveillance footage, witness statements, and a key detail from a local flower vendor all came together to reveal the first significant lead in what was becoming one of the most disturbing cases on Sichang Island in recent memory. A license plate number, captured on camera near the Temple Trail's entrance, was traced back to a motorbike frequently parked near the island's western edge. It belonged to a man named Ranakorn Romruan, a 24-year-old local who, until that moment, had existed mostly on the periphery of the community's attention. Authorities acted swiftly. Officers arrived at Ranakorn's modest home, nestled at the edge of a wooded path, hoping to locate him and begin asking questions about his presence near the scene. But he was not there. His home was locked, quiet. The motorbike was absent. Investigators fanned out across the area, trying to track him down. Something about the sequence of events, the proximity, the timeline, the footage, suggested he might not just be a bystander in this case. They needed answers, and they needed them quickly. As law enforcement delved deeper, a clearer picture of Ranakorn began to form. To the casual observer, he had always been something of a loner, reserved, quiet, often keeping to himself. But beneath that quiet surface, neighbors hinted at something more troubling. Some described his behavior as distant, even slightly unnerving. He rarely made eye contact, avoided social interactions, and spent long hours riding his motorbike through the island's lesser-traveled roads. Others mentioned seeing him pacing alone on the beach at dusk, muttering to himself or staring into the distance as if lost in thought. Few people had ever tried to get close to him, and those who had recalled moments of unpredictable behavior, sharp mood swings, outbursts of frustration, and a tendency to become overwhelmed by social cues. He wasn't violent, they said, but something about his presence had always made people uneasy. So who was this man, and how had his path crossed so tragically with that of Miriam Bielte, a visitor from across the world, simply looking to explore a new place and enjoy a peaceful day? Investigators would later piece together the events of April 7, 2019, with the help of timelines, camera footage, and eventually, Ranakorn's own words. In the early morning hours, while the island remained hushed under the gray-blue light of dawn, Ranakorn woke alone in his small house. It was a morning like many others, except for one crucial difference. Something inside him was restless, unfocused, and unresolved. Unable to sit still, he climbed onto his motorbike and rode aimlessly through the winding coastal roads. At some point, perhaps out of habit or instinct, he found himself near the Temple Trail, a popular spot for both locals and tourists seeking scenic views and a moment of quiet reflection. It was there, at the base of the hill, that he first caught sight of Miriam. She was preparing for her hike, bottle of water in hand, backpack slung casually over one shoulder. There was nothing unusual about her presence. She looked like any other traveler enjoying the island's natural beauty. But something about her struck him. Perhaps her composure, her solitude, or the mere fact that she was alone. In an effort to create what he might have perceived as a reason to approach her, Ronicorn entered a nearby flower stall and purchased a small bouquet of marigolds. To a stranger, it might have looked like a simple act of kindness. But the gesture wasn't entirely innocent. It was calculated, designed to invite interaction. Miriam, walking slowly up the trail, heard footsteps behind her. As she turned slightly, Ronicorn approached, flowers in hand. He attempted to speak with her. His words were polite at first, but there was something about the situation that made Miriam cautious. She accepted the flowers with a tentative smile, thanked him, and continued walking. She did not stop. She did not engage beyond basic courtesy. She was firm in her boundaries, something anyone might do in such a situation. But for reasons that would later be explored during intense police questioning, Ronicorn did not let her go. He continued to follow her up the path. What transpired next was not captured on video. The dense foliage, the elevation, and the remote nature of the trail offered no surveillance coverage beyond the initial steps. But what occurred along that stretch of stone and soil would change lives forever. When authorities finally located Ronicorn, it was not through a dramatic confrontation or high-speed chase. In the hours following the discovery on the hillside, he had returned to his home quietly. He had washed his clothes, though some faint discoloration remained. He had placed the flowers on his table. Then he lay on his couch and turned on the television, seemingly trying to immerse himself in something familiar. Those who later reviewed this moment said it was as if he believed that by resuming ordinary routines, the weight of what had happened might somehow disappear. But the moment of reckoning came swiftly. When the police knocked on his door, he did not resist. He opened it slowly, eyes tired, expression unreadable. There was no outburst, no denial. It was as if he had already accepted that this chapter of his life, however private or confusing it had once been, had come to an end. At the station, Ronicorn initially tried to deflect questions. He gave partial answers and inconsistent timelines, but the pressure mounted. The evidence was solid, and the officers questioning him had years of experience reading subtle emotional cues. Eventually, something broke. His demeanor shifted, and he began to speak more openly. Over the next few hours, Ronicorn confessed. His tone was low, his words often faltering, but he walked investigators through the events as he remembered them. He described seeing Miriam, the impulse to follow, and the interaction on the trail. He described a confrontation, one that started with confusion and ended with irreversible consequences. For the investigators listening, even the most hardened among them, there was a quiet unease. The story, though presented calmly, hinted at a disconnect from empathy, a psychological gap that they would later ask forensic specialists to evaluate. But the investigation was not yet complete. A confession, while valuable, was not enough. Authorities needed to verify the details. To fully understand the sequence of events and rule out any inconsistencies, they initiated a formal reenactment. This is standard procedure in many complex cases, especially when visualizing the flow of actions can clarify questions that verbal descriptions alone cannot answer. Ronicorn was escorted back to the temple trail by officers. To shield him from public exposure, his head was covered and the area was temporarily restricted. Step by step, he retraced his actions from that morning. Officers followed closely, observing his movements and comparing them to the evidence they had gathered. The reenactment that took place on Sichang Island was one of the final steps in an investigation that had shaken the region and echoed far beyond Thailand's borders. As authorities observed Ronicorn Romruan retrace his actions step by step, what had once been just a collection of statements, footage, and fragments of testimony began to take on chilling clarity. This was no longer just a case on paper. It became a vivid, undeniable reality. Each movement he made during the reconstruction provided further insight into what happened on that ill-fated trail, the isolated stretch of nature that had turned into the setting of a tragedy. When the reenactment ended, officers and legal officials reviewing the footage confirmed what they had already feared. They now had a complete and deeply disturbing picture of the sequence of events that took place on April 7th. Though the reenactment was handled with care and conducted behind closed barriers to shield the process from the public, word of its emotional weight and the grim nature of the details spread quickly through both local and international media channels. As the formal trial of Ranakorn Romruan commenced, the courtroom became more than just a legal venue. It became a symbol of the search for justice, not only for Miriam Baelte and her family, but also for a community still struggling to reconcile how something so horrifying could happen in a place so peaceful. The case drew global attention. Miriam, a young and vibrant woman from Germany, had come to Thailand as so many do, to experience its beauty, serenity, and hospitality. What happened to her was not just tragic, it struck at the heart of that very image. The trial proceedings were extensively covered by journalists from around the world. Daily updates were broadcast across news outlets, and photos from the courtroom appeared on front pages and social media feeds across multiple continents. For many, it was unthinkable. A promising life ended so suddenly, with no apparent reason beyond the actions of one individual. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution presented its case with methodical precision. The evidence against Ranakorn was substantial and damning. Surveillance footage captured Miriam beginning her walk to the temple. The flower vendor testified with clarity, recounting how the man had returned alone, looking unsettled and offering a vague excuse about slipping on the trail. These details, combined with his confession, painted a sequence that left little room for doubt. Despite the strength of the case, tension in the courtroom was palpable. Ranakorn's confession, while detailed, lacked the element many had hoped for: remorse. He spoke calmly during his interviews, not offering an apology to Miriam's loved ones, nor expressing regret. That cold demeanor made the atmosphere in the courtroom feel even heavier. It wasn't only about what had happened. It was about the emotional void left in its wake. Yet one of the most unexpected and poignant moments came not from the accused, but from his mother. Her sudden appearance in the courtroom surprised many. She had remained silent during the investigation, unknown to most. Now, standing before the judge and the families in attendance, she addressed the court with a trembling voice that was both sorrowful and sincere. She did not come to defend her son. On the contrary, she spoke with a tone of heartbreak, trying to come to terms with how someone she had raised could cause such harm. She revealed that their relationship had deteriorated in recent years, and that her son had distanced himself, growing more isolated and unpredictable over time. She apologized deeply to Miriam's family, offering not excuses, but a plea for understanding, a search for meaning in a situation where there was none to be found. Her message was simple, yet powerful. Even she believed that justice must be served. Her words, "My son has lost himself, and now he must face what he's done," left a lasting impression on everyone in the courtroom. Ranakorn himself remained silent throughout much of the trial. He did not respond to his mother's emotional speech. His attorneys attempted to present a psychological profile, suggesting that he may have suffered from untreated mental health issues, though this argument never gained traction with the court. The focus remained on the facts of the case and the irreversible consequences of his actions. The judicial process moved quickly, a reflection of the overwhelming evidence and the intensity of public interest. Just 3 months after Miriam's disappearance, the court delivered its verdict. The ruling was swift and uncompromising. Ranakorn Romruan was found guilty and sentenced to capital punishment. Appeals for leniency were submitted by his legal team, but they were denied. The court cited the gravity of the crime, the calculated nature of his actions, and his apparent lack of remorse as key factors in their decision. The reaction was immediate. Outside the courthouse, there was a quiet but powerful expression of solidarity. Mourners gathered holding candles, while others placed flowers in remembrance of Miriam. Though far from her home country, she had become a symbol of innocence lost, and of a community's refusal to let tragedy define them. Back on Chang Island, the emotional weight of the case continued to linger. What was once a serene destination, known for its gentle waves, small temples, and warm smiles, now carried the burden of a memory too painful to forget. The local community, deeply connected to the identity of their island, worked hard to reclaim the peace they once knew. In the weeks following the trial, residents organized vigils and memorial services in Miriam's honor. At the base of the temple trail, visitors and locals alike created a small memorial. Candles, letters, hand-picked flowers, and quiet prayers marked the place where her journey came to an end. It was a space for reflection, for grief, and for the reaffirmation of a shared commitment to peace.